Kim Ji-ha, upon being released from prison, presented the Yulria thought. Yulria is a law corresponding to the harmony of Eastern music in a cosmos infinitely nested as the lesser supreme ultimate and the greater supreme ultimate. Its function is that of attuning all things by rhythm, like a metronome that tunes all the instruments of an orchestra. Kim Mimi summarizes as follows, in a paper on the history of scholarship. The process by which Kim Ji-ha's thought reached all the way to Yulria, after passing from the life of Jeongyeok through the life of Catholicism. That Kim Ji-ha took note of Yulria is because he regarded the Jeongyeok thought of Kim Il-bu, the source of Kim Ji-ha's Yulria, as the Yurching studies unfolding of Jeongyeok. Regarding the reason the Jeongyeok peasant revolution, in which Jeongyeok unfolded, failed as the absence of theory, what was presented as the alternative was Jeongyeok thought, the Yurching studies unfolding of Jeongyeok. The failure of the Jeongyeok peasant movement brought about the paradoxical result that Jeongyeok thought, which had asserted life, took away the most lives. Jeongyeok thought, meeting the new liminality of the machine gun used for the first time in the world, was once again placed at a moment of decision. In fact, after the modernization period, the East Asians of Korea, China, and Japan were in a continuous series of limit situations. Without sufficient information, they always had to encounter new problems and were routinely driven into an ultimate limit situation in which survival was guaranteed, only if they resolved those problems. Problem solving by traditional correlative thinking no longer held good in the new environment of modernity, and, before the harsh new reality of capitalism, one's identity and existence were placed in a limit situation, under a tradition powerless to respond. In a situation where even Jeongyeok, presented as an alternative, had rather enlarged the problem, an alternative was very urgently needed. At this juncture, the Yulria theory of Jeongyeok, an innovative theory based on tradition, could become a theory capable of replacing Jeongyeok. Jeongyeok thought, which is based on Yurching studies and emphasizes principle, could, unlike Jeongyeok, which emphasizes vital energy, be applied more to everyday problems. What was presented alongside Yulria thought in this period is also Kim Ji-ha's Bath thought. The Bath thought that Rice's heaven was presented as a model of a philosophy of life more grounded in reality, as against the philosophy of life of Jeongyeok, which was inclined toward the conceptual. Through Yulria thought, Kim Ji-ha sought to revitalize the liminality triggered by Jeongyeok. Yulria may therefore be seen as the philosophy of life as liminality having been revitalized and appearing as a practical movement. Kim Ji-ha regarded the Jeongyeok thought of Kim Il-bu, which unfolded after the failure of Jeongyeok, as the Yurching studies alternative to Jeongyeok, and took note of the Yulria thought of Jeongyeok. Although Kim Ji-ha founded the Yulria Society, and even served as its first president, Yulria was the most abstruse part, even among the Eastern thought represented by correlative thinking, and so he continually confessed his difficulty in explaining Yulria. Indeed, there has also been research that regards Jeongyeok as the beginning of revitalization. In East Asia, the tradition of revitalization was common not only to Korea, but also to Japan and China. Revitalization theory, unlike the theory of liminality, which emphasizes the internal process of change in response to change, is a theory that explains the change in the process of response to external change. Revitalization theory was first introduced by the anthropologist Anthony F. C. Wallace in his monumental 1956 paper, Revitalization Movements. Just as an individual, when threatened with the possibility that his identity may dissolve, reorganizes and changes his own belief system on the basis of his strengths, puts the changed belief system into practice, and thereby changes his position in society, so to a society, when it meets a crisis in which its social identity may dissolve, revives the strengths of each society's existing cultural tradition, and thereby changes its social belief system. This Wallace named revitalization. According to Wallace, the change in a society's belief system occurs through the mezwe, which is the mental image possessed by a member of a society. According to Wallace, every member of a society, as a part of the social organism, comes to have a mental image, not only of the regularity of his own body, and of the actions his body performs, but also of the society and culture to which he belongs, and it is precisely this image that corresponds to the mezwe. Wallace regarded human society as a vast organism, and the mezway is the way in which each member of society adapts to this social organism. The concept of the mezway includes not only the perception of physical objects within the social environment, but also the perception of the way an individual adjusts in order to minimize given stress, and of the way he adjusts and reconfigures this labyrinth, together with the members of society. When a crisis of social identity comes, a crisis comes to this mezway for the individual, and because this connects even to the crisis of the ideology that constitutes society, rather than being merely a material crisis, it comes to the members of society as a greater threat than a material crisis. To this, society responds with various religious revitalization movements, and some religious movements expand even into political movements. For the leaders of the countless colonial countries in the 19th and 20th centuries, when imperialism was expanding, what was most threatening was not the material crisis, but the crisis of identity. Traditions that had continued for thousands of years were degraded into superstition by Western civilization, and the respected leaders were reduced to swindlers who fomented superstition, so that the belief system of traditional society could no longer maintain the social order, and the individual's social status fell irretrievably. For the general public, too, the collapse of tradition acted as strong mental stress. Even though the new Western belief system was, like the collapsed traditional belief system, a belief system coming from long tradition that could collapse at any time, in a situation where only their own belief system was negated. The method the general public and the leaders could choose was the appropriation of tradition, that is, revitalization that newly interprets the existing tradition. Revitalization was applied to time, space, and human beings alike. In the case of time, it appears as millenarianism, the movement holding that a new age will arrive, and in the case of space, it also becomes an earthly paradise movement holding that a new utopia will arrive. In human terms, syncretism, in which religious doctrines are blended, also appears, and non-resistance also appears politically. Most of the 19th and 20th century religious movements can be classified as types of revitalization, and in the case of Jeongyeok, all of these types are synthesized. Revitalization theory set out from a theory that sought to evaluate the birth and development of religious organizations on the basis of an inquiry in 1952 into the Longhouse movement that appeared among the Iroquois in the early 19th century, which had been waged by Handsome Lake, the prophet of the Seneca, one of the Indian tribes. Just as the capitalist material culture of the West and Japan raised a crisis of identity in the Joseon society of the time, Joseon, which had known only the long clan law order centered on China, as the whole of the world, so too, for the Indians, who had lived for long ages with cultural pride, the Western culture, and the Western people who toppled their own authority with guns and swords came as a great shock. For the Iroquois, the representative Indian tribe of the northeastern United States where New York is located, that shock came all the greater. Handsome Lake, who had been one of the leadership class of the Seneca, one of the Iroquois, was also a figure who had gravely undergone a crisis of identity under the colonial policy of the United States. The period in which Handsome Lake lived was a time when American gold mines were discovered, and the gold rush was underway. With the emergence of this gold rush, the status of the Indians who in the past had made contracts state to state, on an equal footing with the United States fell, so that they were reduced to a protectorate, just as Joseon too, which had lost its status as a state at the time of the Japan-Korea annexation, was reduced to a protectorate. What makes revitalization important in the study of Kim Ji-ho's thought is the point that the national thought treated by revitalization is the beginning of humanity's universal thought. Since any universal thought must set out from the thought of a particular people, in order to achieve a universal thought, the revitalization of national thought must first take precedence. The starting point on the road toward a thought of reconciliation and coexistence lies in the revitalization of national thought. The revitalization presented in Jeongyeok thought was precisely the reinterpretation of the tradition of the Joey. That Kim Ji-ho took note of Jeongyeok for the reinterpretation of tradition is because, in the modernization period, the three countries of Korea, China, and Japan sought to fuse Western thought through countless theories based on tradition such as Chinese essence, Western function, yet there was no theory that fundamentally reinterpreted tradition as Jeongyeok did. The Yulria thought of Jeongyeok was, as Jang Jinhong said, a logic that consistently unifies tradition. The logic that Jeongyeok pursued was the consistency of the East Asian five phases system, that is Patay, Yeongsang, and Yardae. The Patay, Yeongsang, and Yardae of Jeongyeok were clearly elucidated by Jangzin, but they were already implied in Jeongyeok thought. This can be interpreted as the religious ideological change as mythos, logos, and theos of which Jang Jinhong spoke, but the Jeongyeok interpretation has been expressed more mathematico-logically by Han Tae-dong. Kim Ji-ha is a form that expresses this in literary terms. Looking first at Han Tae-dong's explanation, Confucianism, Buddhism, and Taoism are logically connected to one another as liminality. Han Tae-dong's research, which expressed Confucianism, Buddhism, and Taoism in mathematical logic, indirectly shows that Confucianism, Buddhism, and Taoism are not merely philosophies but scientific theories based on yin-yang and the five phases. The characteristics of Confucianism, Buddhism, Taoism, and Christianity become clearly evident in how they define the relationship of friend and foe. Confucianism, which delights in learning and practicing it in due time, and delights when a friend comes from afar and again visits, holds that the ruler must be ruler-like, and the subject must be subject-like, so that, in the relationship of friend and foe, friend is friend, and foe is foe, as against Spring Confucianism, which drives friend and foe apart like a repulsive force. Taoism, the long-standing arch-rival of Confucianism, holds that the way called the way is not the way, that being is non-being, and non-being is being, that the weakest water is the strongest, and that the ugliest person is the most beautiful, so that foe is friend and friend is foe, as against Taoism of explosive force and latent concealment, which arranges foe and friend symmetrically. Buddhism, the long-standing mediator of Confucianism and Taoism, asserts a total emptiness in which there is neither friend nor foe. Of course, Christianity, which brought about a great innovation in the triangular relationship of Confucianism, Buddhism, and Taoism, encompasses all of Confucianism, Buddhism, and Taoism, with respect to Buddhism, through the words, "Love your enemy." In the end, the Yulria manifested in the Jeongyeok thought of which Kim Ji-ha speaks may be interpreted in the sense that the syncopation and harmony of mutually different systems of thought are logically achieved. Kim Ji-ha stated, in his acceptance remarks at the awards ceremony of the Jang Ji-year Literary Prize, that the poetry of Jang Ji-yong could be an example of fusing mutually opposed systems of thought.